Everyone can see the screen, hopefully, can see my presentation, except for me. What's going on here? Yeah. Okay, so how to be a nutter. You guys might have to bear with me. I've never done a presentation on Zoom before. I've done a few meetings. So yeah, I was gonna start with a little territorial acknowledgement. And I'm here on Denman, which is the traditional territory of the Qualicum, the Petlatch, the Comox, and the Tla'amin. And I'm really honored to be here as a guest. And also, I think as people who are growing things and tending to the land and stewarding land, this really important contemplation around who has been here before doing that and some of the implications of our own presence here. And I think also opportunities, I think with nut trees in particular, one of the reasons I'm so excited about them is because of kind of abundance mindset that I get from engaging with nut tree culture and growing nuts. So this idea that in 50 years the land around us will have a food source that produces every year, and that to me is super exciting, and that movement towards thinking about abundance rather than scarcity, I think, is something that we need as a culture. And I think it fits into looking back at how First Peoples were on the land here and how they really experienced abundance around them. And not to say that scarcity isn't around as well, but just that I think focusing on the abundance is really an important thing for us to do. So yeah, I'm Dylan. I live at Ruby Slipper Ranch, where we have our own kind of section of the farm that we call Woven Grove. And we are looking out at it right now. We're planting about 4 acres of mixed orchard. So it's hazelnuts, chestnuts, walnuts, apples. What else do we got? We got some other weird things, and we got pears and quince. And we also grow vegetables, which you might see at the general store. Yeah, so my experience growing nut trees is kind of, it's an interest that is now finally coming to fruition, and in a bigger way. I've started a lot of nut trees over the years, but I haven't had a place to plant my own, and now that's happening. And I'm with my partner Emily. We're caretaking these nut trees, and they're growing fast, which is exciting. So we're hoping to be harvesting lots of nuts in the future. I believe that both Nick and Peter are also here. I see Peter there, and I think I saw Nick before. And so Nick and Peter are both also into nut trees and have agreed to maybe add to the discussion, and maybe like on certain points, if you guys want to say something, just unmute yourself and budge in there. I mean, I think there's probably lots of information we're not going to cover today, but I think just if there's things that you feel like, oh, that's an important point, it would be really nice to get that added. And also at the end, when we do questions, I think that it'd be great to have all 3 of us answering questions. Okay, so hang on a minute, Erica. Okay, next slide. In theory, oh, there we go. Okay, so, oh God, why grow nuts? Okay, the reason that I think you get this kind of like, you get these people who are into growing nut trees, and like I'm one of them. And I think part of the attraction is this idea that you have a sustenance food that is a perennial. So, you know, you think of things like grain. It takes a lot of energy to replant the grain every year and get the harvest and deal with it. Whereas nuts, once they're established, they are producing every year. And so this perennial thing is a really key piece of why people are keen on growing nuts. And it kind of adds to this idea of food security of having food around us that we know will be producing even when there's turbulence potentially in the future, you know. So even if the you know, there's a major grain problem, they have trouble growing grain in the prairies and there's a grain shortage, well, all of a sudden we won't have food for our chickens and we won't have enough grain for making bread. And so having these trees there, you know, it'd be great if they were planted 50 years ago, but having them there in the future could be really helpful. And not to mention just creating a local economy where we are more self-sufficient and resilient. That's a huge thing. And so we do grow a lot of vegetables out here, as I mean, probably a lot of you have gardens, and I think that's awesome. And there is, you know, there is things like, there is protein and carbohydrates in vegetables, but we tend to not have a huge amount of protein production and fat production and carbohydrate production like locally. And so I think one thing I see is that nuts are an opportunity to kind of cover our bases a bit better and build a local food culture that has those things provided. And I know that like the protein and fat, I think that like walnuts and pecans and hickories, and I think hazels too, they all have a pretty good balance of proteins, fats, and carbs. And I believe that you can like survive off a diet of those nuts alone, like one of those types of nuts alone. I don't think it would be ideal, but I think there might be other issues with eating too many nuts and having allergic reactions and stuff. But there is a very good nutrient kind of balance there. So it's something to keep in mind, is that these things are quite healthy. So yeah, going into like, we have climate instability, we have climate change, and we know that it's probably going to get hotter here. And so that's actually a good thing for growing nuts, it seems. It seems like we're in a good spot for that, as long as we can keep the water flowing. And we are meant to, I don't know if anyone's seen the Islands Trust put out a study that they contracted out that basically look at what the Islands Trust region is going to look like in terms of climate and like what's likely. And we're going to be hotter. We're going to have warmer winters, so not as many freeze events, and we're going to be slightly wetter, so we're going to have really wet winters, which that could be a challenge for some nuts. But I think overall we're going to get a bit hotter, but not like crazy hotter, and less freezes could be good for certain things in terms of not, you know, things that don't like getting really cold might be able to survive in the future. So yeah, I think one thing is that nuts are really good for home scale and hobby farms. You know, having a few different types of nut trees could really add some interesting stuff to a household diet. And also, like, they're kind of they can be a pleasant thing to harvest and to process. And I think partly I'll talk about it a bit more, but like, yeah, just having that kind of rhythm in life of like, oh yeah, now it's October and we're harvesting the nuts and bring them in as a part of the winter sustenance. And the last point on this slide is silvopasture potential. And I don't know if folks know what silvopasture means, but it's basically the combination of trees and animals, like domestic animals. So looking at using trees to feed your livestock, essentially. And so there is really good examples, like in northern Italy, the chestnuts and pigs were a big tradition. So pigs would be fattened at the end of the year. They'd clean up the leftover chestnuts, and you'd have some really tasty pigs. So there's potential to have orchards or even rows of trees around the edge of fields that would still be used for hay. and that could also be, they could be cleaned up after you've done your harvest. Potentially the animals can clean them up for you. So there's a good opportunity there, which if people are interested in animals as well, that's a good way to look at why nuts might be a real benefit. So yeah, where are commercial nut orchards located generally? There's not a ton around here. There is actually one hazelnut orchard on Hornby Island, which is quite young. It's about she must be getting on 10 years now. And so yeah, Charlotte got in on this new blight resistant hazel study. So she basically got a subsidized orchard installation, which is pretty cool. And she's producing a lot of nuts over there.
Oh no. Are you so sad?
She's got
Give me a
2
hug.
or 3 acres.
He died because he was meditating for
Someone
so
is
long, and then his fought.
There we go. Yeah, so there is a small hazelnut industry in BC. It mostly has been centered in the Lower Mainland, the Fraser Valley. It has, I think, shrunk over the last decade due to the Eastern Filbert blight, which I will talk a bit more about later. But there is actually incentives for planting hazelnut trees, and there is a really good resource. I think it's the BC Hazelnut Growers Association, which really makes the case for how you grow hazelnuts and why you should do it. But they have had trouble getting people to replant them, and that's partly because of the next point, which is the challenge of land prices. I mean, we all know that land prices around here are a little bit kooky, and when you look at farming in general, it's pretty hard to make a good profit, and the kind of time constraints, the slow return, which is another point here, is of an orchard of nut trees, is makes it really hard to make that investment. I mean, you have big upfront investment, you have no return for some years, and then you have uncertainties like blight and stuff. So there is some challenges that mean we don't have a lot of nut orchards. And there is some other ones on Vancouver Island, other hazelnut orchards that seem to be doing good business as far as I can tell. And it's a lot of work, but they do have a quality product that they can command a high price. In terms of other types of nuts, I mean, people probably mostly know that there is walnuts and almonds grown, and walnuts definitely we could be looking at trying to grow here a bit more. Almonds as well, but they're a bit more marginal. And chestnuts is another big one that I'm particularly interested in, and there actually is a commercial chestnut orchard just south of the border on the mainland, the Washington company, and I think he does quite well and it's a successful business. So that's actually one point where you'll probably notice that I'm most keen on chestnuts and their potential. And I mean, one of the interesting numbers that I've heard, and it's probably a 5 or 10 year old number, but it's of the chestnuts consumed in North America, which isn't a ton. Obviously, we're not a huge chestnut culture, but of the chestnuts consumed in North America, 97% are imported. So it shows that there is potential for some commercial opportunities there, if we can get production figured out. And yeah, I mean, the last point here is that we lack a nut culture. We don't have huge traditions, or maybe at Christmas people might get the mixed nuts and crack them with a nutcracker. And I do remember as a kid in Vancouver, we'd go to Van Dusen Gardens and get roasted chestnuts, like around Christmas time. So there is little bits of potential there, and I think that's something that can be grown upon. And you look at some of these cultures, like a lot of Mediterranean cultures, really, you know, the chestnuts were huge. And you look also at First Nations cultures, not around here so much, but in the States, and both chestnuts and hickories and pecans were really important in the diet. And so there's all sorts of ways in which I think those things happen slowly, but developing a culture that appreciates this abundance and this food source and figures out how to use it and how to get excited about it, and you know, having that seasonal thing where you come back and you're like, oh yeah, the roasted chestnuts are here again. That's I think that's a real something that goes along with the actual growing of the trees is creating the culture. And that can be on a home scale too, like, you know, having, like I said before, like having your own nuts that you harvest every year and you have your recipes, you know, that's I think an exciting thing to look into. Okay, so what nuts can we grow? I mean, you could probably try other ones as well, but there isn't a ton of other ones. And these are going to be, your easiest ones are going to be chestnuts, hazelnuts, and walnuts. And yeah, walnuts and friends. The friends are things like different types of walnuts from different parts of the world. And like heart nuts is one, which I believe is a Japanese walnut. And pecans and hickories are probably both kind of in that friends of walnuts sort of thing. And they are a bit of an experiment here, a bit marginal, but I think there's a good chance that we'll get some decent crops from them. And I think that's something that Peter and Nick and I are all kind of like waiting for to see how they do over time. Pine nuts, there is pine nuts on Denman Island, which is exciting. Bruce and Leandra have some mature stone pines that produce real tasty nuts and have survived without irrigation, I think, for 20 years and have grown quite big. So pine nuts, there's all sorts of pine nuts from around the world. And well, I'll talk a bit more about that. And almonds, there is some varieties of almonds that do grow here. I will when we get to that one, I'll let Peter talk about it because I think he's probably got more experience than I do with that. But well, I'm going to go through each of these. They each get their own slide. And there's going to be some pictures in the slides too, which is a change from these boring text slides. And yeah, before the slides or the pictures, Peter sent me a bunch of slides or a bunch of pictures, which has been really helpful. So thank you, Peter. Okay, chestnuts. So that picture at the top there, that's a 1,000-year-old chestnut tree in Portugal. And you can see it's still got chestnuts on it, still producing chestnuts. And I just found that picture and I thought, man, that's cool. Like imagine planting a tree that lasts 1,000 years and provides for people and probably animals for that all that time. It's not the prettiest tree at this point, but it's pretty cool. So they're pretty fast growing, and they get pretty big, and they're high in carbs and sugars. Like one interesting anecdote that I heard about chestnuts is that when Napoleon, at a certain point, Napoleon really wanted some sugar self-sufficiency in France, and because they were pretty reliant on sugar, and it was, you know, attached to this overseas empire. And so he created we need to figure out a local sugar source, and out of that came the sugar beet. But one of the other front runners was the chestnut. So you can basically process chestnuts into refined sugar, which, not that we need more of that, but it does show what they're made of, you know, partly. And it didn't, yeah, the sugar beet was more efficient, and the chestnuts also, I think in Europe had a blight around then, so they got quite sick, and they weren't the best choice. And actually, that leads into the next point there, where they are as a staple. The chestnut in the Mediterranean region is kind of known as a peasant food, and traditionally was a peasant food. So that was also kind of something that didn't do well for it as a choice to replace or to be a sugar substitute, was that it was kind of associated with peasants, and that was not considered a good thing. But from my point of view, that's actually pretty cool. And when you read about these cultures, that that was the backbone of their diet, that was their bread basically, and they made flours out of it, made bread out of it too. So yeah, there's a bunch of different species. Yeah, American, European, Chinese, and Japanese, and other smaller different ones. But those four main ones are kind of what mostly is grown in orchards, and they're basically they do hybridize with each other, so you get a kind of a mix, and generally some are better tasting nuts, bigger nuts, and yeah, I won't go into too much details about that. The American chestnuts were decimated by chestnut blight, which was probably, I don't know, it was a couple hundred years ago or 150 years ago. And basically before that, the American chestnut went all the way up into Ontario and all the way down to Florida, and was a huge part of the food culture of First Peoples there, and I think of Pilgrims as well. We're lucky that the chestnut blight never made it across the Rockies, but even so, American chestnuts are really susceptible to it, and so people generally don't plant fully American chestnuts because of that. Yeah. So actually, yeah, Peter and Nick, do you have anything else to add about chestnuts?
Not really. I think that's great. Chestnuts are great. One of the reasons that we're excited about them here is they're really tolerant of sandy, gravelly, kind of marginal soils where you wouldn't just be able to grow many other food plants. And they, in places where they're native trees, they thrive on kind of rocky hillsides. And so that's kind of a special niche for chestnuts, where you could produce a lot of food in land that's considered pretty marginal.
This is a nut guy.
I think the only thing I'd say along the lines of that is they're also completely intolerant of wet soil, and if you plant them in poor drainage, clay, waterlogged soil, they'll be dead in 2 years. And I've had a lot of customers come back at me with that reality. That, and just to emphasize that they're primarily starch and low fat, which is unique in the nut world. I think that's it.
Great. Yeah. I think the other thing is the fast growing thing is something just to, like, nuts can be a real long waiting game. And we've been kind of experimenting with growing them as fast as possible. And we have some that this year, they're 2 years old from seed, and they're 8 feet tall. And I'll go more into about how we're doing that. But I think that's where I see a lot of potential for something that can, kind of reduce that waiting game and have a real good harvest quickly. Okay, gonna go to hazelnuts. So most people know hazelnuts, and yeah, like I was saying, they're grown commercially in the Pacific Northwest. The Willamette Valley in Oregon is kind of like, I think it's the second biggest hazelnut producing region of the world, and I think Turkey is the first. But I think it's a different, the production quality in Oregon is like way high. They have a very mechanized, technological, kind of like modern industry, whereas I think in Turkey it's much more like backwoods kind of thing. Yeah, high in protein and fats. You know, they're quite rich. You get hazelnut oils you can press out of them. And they generally tolerate heavier soils. And that's kind of something to, you know, compared to the chestnut, it's a very different kind of area which they'll thrive in. Now, that being said, they don't want to be in a marsh. But there is a hazelnut farm in the Cowichan Valley that I've visited in the winter, and the bottom few rows of trees actually were in the, you know, basically in a lake in the winter. And the guy there said as long as the water level has left the roots by the time the trees wake up, that he found it was fine. And actually, on that note, interestingly enough, like they're out of Oregon, there's interesting charts about like they basically show like different types of soil and different drainage amounts of soil, and this chart would calculate for you if your yield would be gained by adding drainage to the soil before planting an orchard, and by how much, and whether that was worth the cost of adding the drainage. So you get, I think drainage is still good because roots sitting in water often will die, and they'll have to regrow. But it's not necessarily the most necessary thing. More necessary is probably moving on to Eastern filbert blight, which has decimated the industry in Oregon, and that's partly because almost all the trees were genetically identical. The one variety, Barcelona, was the most popular and was very susceptible to the blight. And so now we're in a phase of the industry's had to kind of restart itself and shift over to blight resistant varieties, which have been mostly, there's different sources, but majority of the ones you're seeing around here are from Corvallis. So they were bred in Corvallis to be blight resistant and to basically save the industry because the trees were getting very sick. And so that's, if you're planting hazelnuts, it's probably wise to plant blight resistant varieties. You know, it doesn't seem like we have it on Denman, but we do know it's in the Comox Valley. So in some ways, it seems like only a matter of time until it gets here, and it basically doesn't. If your tree is susceptible to it, you're not likely to be able to save your tree. I guess you can spray a lot of fungicide, but I don't think that's probably on most people's plates here to do that. And even then, I think it's a losing battle. So we've been experimenting somewhat with planting seedlings of so planting seed from the blight resistant orchard in Hornby. And my understanding is that because it's a dominant trait, I think it means that 3 out of 4 of those seedlings will have the blight resistant genetics. So that's a risk that we've been willing to take, but it's not necessarily advisable from like a industry perspective. But also in that we're working with bringing in new genetics, and maybe we'll get a really good result, something that's blight resistant and bigger and tastier. So that's part of the the experimentation of working with seedlings, and rather than just cloning everything. And both Peter and Nick have quite a bit of experience with that. And there's reasons to do it, and there's reasons that it's going to offer, it's going to be challenging in other ways. And yeah, so.
Can I jump in there, Dylan?
Yeah, for sure.
I got a call from the folks at, I think it's called Nature Tech. They just moved to the Comox Valley, and they're the people who were doing the intensive propagation of the Corvallis clones. And they are really unhappy that I'm selling seed grown trees because of the blight susceptibility factor, and they wanted me to make it really clear that, well, they wanted me to stop selling seed grown trees, but they also want, if I was going to keep doing it, label them very clearly that they were not actually fully blight resistant. They were only 75% blight resistant. So that debate continues on.
Great.
Oh, can I jump in with one thing as well,
Yes.
really quickly? I'm Letitia. I also am growing nuts with Nick at the snag, and we have a very prolific hazelnut tree on the property in water, but in pretty wet conditions. So we have had at least a semi-positive experience with marsh growing hazelnuts.
Oh, cool.
It was
That's
planted by
great.
the previous owners, but it's probably over, I don't know, 10, 12 feet tall.
Yeah, and maybe just on the growing from seed and blight and resistance thing, I think it's great that Peter is growing some seedlings, because diseases are mutating all the time, right? And you know, the reason that, like Dylan said, the reason that blight decimated everything is because growers were only growing a few cultivars, and now they've bred another 3 or 4 cultivars that are supposed to be blight resistant, but they're resistant to this current strain of eastern filbert blight, and there's going to be new diseases in the future. And so genetic diversity is a huge thing, I think, to be thinking about in terms of all nut trees.
And even on that note, the varieties that they have bred are not, they're resistant. They're not immune to blight. And so if you are growing hazelnuts and you start to see something that looks like blight, I think it's kind of like wounds that ooze. Is that right, Peter? Anyways, you should be dealing with that.
They're kind of like, I mean, everyone should actually be checking this on their trees if they have hazelnut trees. And I got to see a tree just at the base of the Churchill. I don't know if that's what it's called in Courtney, like Knapp Hill.
Mission Hill.
Mission Hill, yeah. They are lines of black dots that kind of look like craters, and they're all in sort of linear rows on the young twigs. So it stands out, and anyone with hazels on Denman should, you know, just as far as surveying goes, check their trees and for that damage. And you can Google it and see what it looks like, and it's very distinct, and it would be good to know if it ever does show up here.
And a part of what it's the control of it is partly like you can take those trees out quickly so it's not proliferating, and you can spray it with copper, and so there is like methods that are used to try and stop it from spreading. And you know, as responsibility to the community, it would be great to stop it from spreading. I mean, it would help save the rest of the hazelnut trees. There's some chats here. I'm just gonna check. Oh, Peter, you got a question around that particular tree. It was their property. Maybe you can just write back.
I'm a real Zoom noob here, so I'll try.
All right, I'm gonna move on to walnuts, because we got so yeah, there is quite a few walnuts around. They often were planted by homesteaders, and I don't think there's any old orchards in this region, but often old farms would have a few walnut trees. And I think there is some younger orchards that have been planted around the valley. And again, it's a waiting game to see how long, you know, it takes a while till they produce. But if you go down to California, there is commercial production, you know, large scale, and certainly if you're interested in propagating walnuts or growing walnuts, the UC Davis, I think, has some really good resources around like industry standards for getting walnuts. And actually, there's a guy who does videos for them, that this old farmer that I watched some grafting videos, and they're quite entertaining. Character. And so there's many species of juglans, which is the family that walnuts are a part of. And yeah, so walnuts, the kind of regular walnut is one that we probably know the best, but there's a picture of heart nuts down below here on the screen. And there's lots of other ones you can experiment with. There's black walnuts. But generally, if you want something that you can crack easily and is going to give you a nice nut that you're kind of used to, then a regular walnut is what you probably want to grow. They're high in fats and protein. They're big trees. They also have a allelopathic thing where they can be quite harmful to other plants that grow around them. So they can be a little bit challenging to, you don't want to plant one right next to an apple tree, because it'll probably kill the apple tree over time, or at least set the apple tree back. Now, that being said, I've heard people say, they didn't find that was a problem for them. So it doesn't necessarily, just because that's what science says happens, doesn't mean that it happens in every single case. And one thing with walnuts is that grafted trees generally are going to produce sooner. And that's, so yeah, if you plant a seedling, it's a little bit unclear how long it'll take to produce. And I've heard some people say, it took, my seedling tree 30 years to produce. Whereas I think grafted trees generally, you know that they're going to be producing within 5 years, or even when they're small, they'll try to produce, which isn't necessarily the best thing. You might rather them actually grow bigger, so they produce more later. And generally, I believe there's rootstock for walnuts, either black walnuts or a paradox, which is a cross between black walnut and a regular walnut. Those studies I've seen show that by grafting onto those, the yield is usually increased by about a third. So that's what the industry basically uses paradox as their rootstock. And that's an advantage over time. If you imagine a third more nuts every year, that's a pretty worthwhile thing. So I'm just learning how to graft walnuts. I've heard that you can buy cultivars at Costco sometimes in the spring for pretty cheap. And hopefully in the next number of years, we can figure out how to do it well here and actually be providing people with grafted walnuts. In the meantime, I would say planting seedlings is also a good choice, especially if you can make them work in a way where they grow really fast. Because I believe, without being sure, I know with chestnuts, I've read studies where they talk about the production starting based on the size of the tree. So it needs to be tall enough and big enough that it decides to start producing nuts. And I have a sense, and I haven't read about this, but that walnuts are similar, that if you can grow them fast, give them lots of fertility, get them up, then they will say, okay, well, it's time to reproduce, and they'll produce nuts. So I think that's with walnuts also have a tendency to grow fast if you give them the right stuff. And I think that's something to, there is a tree on the farm here that's right next to a garden area that I think it's about 6 or 7 years old, and it's been producing nuts for a couple of years. So it was 4 or 5 years old, it started producing nuts, and it got a lot of fertility, and it's like 15 feet high now. And so compared to ones that were planted at the same time that didn't get as much water or fertility, and still aren't producing and aren't as big, you can really see that you can control these things some way. It's not just gonna happen. Okay, the last one on there is walnut husk fly, which has become something that Denman, people who own walnut trees in Denman have become familiar with over the last number of years. And it's pretty unfortunate. It's a fly that lays its eggs in the husk, the outer kind of green shell of the walnut, and the larvae, the little maggots, basically live and feed in the husk and make it into kind of a rotten mess. And it doesn't necessarily destroy the nuts, although it does sometimes damage the nuts, but it makes them a real hassle to process. So yeah, there is controls for it, but generally your controls are pesticides that you target the adult flies with. So you're trying to break the cycle so that next year you don't have as many. Oh yeah, I should say they also, the walnuts fall and the larvae go down into the soil a couple inches, and that's kind of how the process works, and then they come back up as flies and start the thing again next year. So there is some ways to deal with that on the home scale. One is to lay tarps down so that process doesn't happen. And people have been experimenting with poultry, so you get your poultry underneath there to eat as fast as possible or as much as possible. I mean, presumably you're not going to get eradicated completely. It's going to be something that you can work to control over time. And there is one pesticide that is organic certified that you can use. Yeah, I kind of did some reading about it just for this particular talk, and I mean, when I read about it, but it's a pretty big, it's a big commitment to be imagining these big trees, and you got to spray up in the tree to get rid of the fly. It's something I think good to monitor and good to probably start with the tarp option. So when you're harvesting, and the other thing that they say is really important in that regard is if you have nuts that are falling early or nuts that are falling late, you want to pick them up and get them out of there so that they're not sending their larvae into the soil. Especially ones I think that are falling early might be falling early because the larvae has gotten the nut and the tree decides to drop it. Yeah, lots to learn there, and something that you might want to consider whether or not you want to plant walnuts. Walnuts can also handle wet soil more so than like chestnuts or something. So they're another one. And they like rich soil. They're probably not as willing to be put in dry, rocky soil, although they will. I think they'll survive, and they probably over time could thrive as well. So yeah, that's the walnuts and friends. Any Nick, Letitia, and Peter, anything to add?
What I really want to know, and I don't know, is how much more resistant heart nuts are, or even black walnuts are, to the husk fly, and whether we should just transition over to growing them instead. But I've never been able to find that info.
Yeah. Well, one thing.
Well, I think.
Oh,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Lynn.
Well, I was gonna say I got some black walnut seed from our friends in the Cowichan Valley, and it was full husk fly. So yeah, black walnut definitely susceptible.
Yeah, we didn't really know what husk fly was before Dylan told us, but we have some heart nuts here, and we also have husk fly. Like now that we've looked, we're like, oh yeah, there's husk flies in there. But I think so far in our experience, they haven't really damaged the nuts at all. So you end up with gross husks sometimes, and some of them are a little brown and rotten, but I think pretty much all the nuts themselves are intact. And so I don't know, maybe hard nuts. Hard nuts are kind of cool in some ways because they grow really fast. And so they, like in terms of the ones that we've seen, they grow. We had a walnut and a heart nut and a Bwart nut that we think were all planted at the same time by the previous owners. And the heart nuts are probably 20 to 30 feet, and the Bwart nut is like 40 feet. That's a hybrid between butternut and heart nut or Japanese walnut. And then the regular English walnut, that is kind of the common one that people know, that was only 10 feet. And those were probably all kind of similarly neglected, probably planted and then left alone for, mostly alone for between 7 to 10 years, we think.
And are they all producing?
No, just the heart nuts are producing. Well, yeah, the Bwart nut does make nuts, but they're pretty bad. I think the Bwart nut, from what I understand, has a ton of genetic variation because you're basically creating a hybrid that has access to all the genetics from heart nut and all the genetics from butternut. And so the kind of nut that you get could be really big and good and prolific, or it could be what we have, which is like an extremely hard-shelled, difficult to crack thing that even if you can get it open, there's like some crappy fragmented kernels in there.
And how do you find the hard nuts for cracking and eating?
They're awesome.
Yeah, they're great. They are kind of hard shelled, and so we got a cracker from Grimo Nut Nursery that works really well. But one of the things that Grimo and other heart nut people like to promote is it's the only walnut that can be cracked perfectly, and so you can crack it at the seam and then it opens and it creates a perfect heart-shaped kernel. And some people think that's really cool. And yeah, for us, they were, like I said, they were totally neglected for maybe a decade. And once we started watering them and kind of cleared around them, they've gotten really happy and have been pretty productive in the last couple of years.
Great. There's a question in the chat that maybe one of you guys know the answer to. I'm drawing a blank. Is Eric is wondering if walnuts self-pollinate. I don't believe that they do.
I think they're wind pollinated. So some are, my understanding is that some can be a little self-fertile, like if they don't have friends around them, they might be able to produce a few nuts, but you really need several individuals that aren't the same cultivar. So if you're planting, you get 2 grafted walnuts, you probably want to get 2 different cultivars, 2 different named varieties.
Great. All right. Pecans.
One last thing, did we talk about juglone?
About what?
Juglone? Like the walnut?
Yeah, but I didn't talk about it by name, but.
Okay, great. Yeah, great.
Yeah, juglone's the stuff that the walnuts secrete that makes other plants around them not as happy. Yeah, okay. Pecans, so I mean, pecans might seem, people might be like, what, we can grow those? But there is a northern pecan that grows all the way up into Ontario, and so we're experimenting with planting some of those, and hopefully in 50 years we'll have some really good genetics that love it here and produce good pecans here. but we don't know yet. I guess, I don't know. Peter, do you have any ones that are older? Maybe Peter's not there at the moment. As far as I know, Peter doesn't have any that are producing yet, but he may have some that are planted. We've started a bunch, and we're going to be planting them out and seeing if we can get them to grow up and produce nuts. I mean, pecans are related to walnuts, and you know, knowing that they can survive up into Ontario, I think my biggest concern about them producing here is going to be more based on, do we have enough heat to ripen the nuts, rather than do we have, you know, can they survive here? There's a couple more questions that just came in the chat. Heidi's asking if all nuts produce juglin, and yes, they do, as far as I know. Black walnuts, I think, produce more, but
Yeah, and my understanding is that pecans and hickories also produce a little bit of juglin or however you say it.
yeah.
There's also, if I don't want to go too down this rabbit hole, but there's a nerdy debate out there between, some people have the theory that juglone can be controlled and mitigated quite a bit based on soil profile. And so some people think that it's actually like the soil biology that determines the toxicity of juglone a lot more than is currently thought.
Okay, so you can control it potentially. I mean, there's also an advantage to it in that it will knock back, you know, grasses and weeds too. So if you're trying to grow the tree by itself, then that's quite useful. It's when it becomes, you know, when you're trying to grow a polyculture that it can be a challenge. I clicked ahead by mistake here, but I think hickories are kind of, well, pecans are actually a type of hickory. It's walnuts, and hickories generally have, there's a bunch of different types, but the shagbark and the shellbark seem to be the ones that are most common, at least that we can have access to seeds for so far. And they grow up in Ontario as well. So again, I think at least cold wise, we should be able to grow them. And the question is, do we get enough heat, and do we get enough do they get too wet, I guess, is another question. Cold and wet are both different things. And the one cool thing about hickories, and one reason that they haven't become super commercial, is that they tend to they don't produce the same crop every year. They tend to have big years every 2 or 3 or 4 years, which, you know, if you, yeah, it could be something that you save a bunch up and then you have them, rather than having to pick them every year. Yeah, and I know, like someone was saying that Dave and Mary have grown pecans, I think hickories as well. And I don't know how big theirs are, and I don't know if they're here. I don't think they're here, but definitely they could be resources if someone's really keen on growing these things. They have probably older trees than I do, because mine are only a year old. So again, this is something where there's potential. There's probably, you know, it's a bit of a novel idea. So we got to look at, you know, how do we get to a place where we actually can grow good hickories here? And some people might not think it's worth their time. Anything else on hickories, guys?
The place where I'm excited to try hickories is in like wetter spots where like Dylan mentioned, that hazelnuts can do well in the wet, but the nice thing about hickories is because they're not a bush, you can just stick a tree tube on them. And so we're gonna try in some of our wetter kind of marshy areas, just plunking in hickories and seeing how they do, because apparently in Ontario, they can tolerate.
Great. There you go. There's an idea. And we're going to talk more about the tree shelters, tree tubes coming up here as well. So pine nuts, people have all probably eaten pine nuts, and there's actually a lot of different types of pine nuts from around the world. They're generally not super cultivated. Like, there is pine nut orchards, but I believe that most of the North American supply comes from wild trees and pinyon pines in like Arizona and New Mexico. So, but I think in Italy they do have an industry, but again, they're super slow growing, and they don't produce until they're quite big. And hence that's why the price is so high for pine nuts. So there's many types. There's Asian ones, like Korean pines are one we're growing. There's Italian ones. There's North American ones, and I think any pine tree has a nut. It's just some of them are tiny. And I think the one on the left bottom where you can actually see the nuts, that I believe is a Korean pine. And the other one is a monkey puzzle tree, which also produces nuts, and is in that, it is a pine essentially. Again, we're looking at, they're pretty experimental, but what's cool about them is that they can survive without a lot of water, and they like sandy soil. And I would think they're even somewhat deer resistant as well. So there might be, places where you feel it's worth it to put some in if you have the right kind of land for it, and you're thinking long term. I mean, that's the other thing. It's a lot of people don't have it's hard to say, well, yeah, we'll have pine nuts in 20 years, and it's worth like putting these in and instead of something else. So but I think there's a lot of potential. And I know in Ontario there was a really interesting resource on these people in Ontario who basically planted a whole bunch of different types of pines, and they're doing it commercially, and I think they're finding it successful. So if you have a long game plan, it could totally work. Nick and Peter, anything about pines?
I can attest to their slow growth. The ones that I've grown for 2 years look pretty similar to the first year ones. They're about 4 inches high. But one of the crucial things about Korean pines is they crucially need this bacteria, or the symbiotic, I can't remember if it's a bacteria or fungus. I think it's a mycorrhizal fungus.
Mycorrhizal, yeah.
And it's hard to get. It's not just a random mycorrhizae that you get it if you buy one of those myco packs, like the standard ones. And so that's something that I'm going to be working on this year, is getting that thing. And I think that's really supposed to help their growth. And that's like, they can get pretty stunted if you don't have that. The Korean pines can. And in general, I think a place where we're excited about pines is like the even rockier, even crappier soil that we wouldn't necessarily put chestnuts in, or even try to irrigate them. So like, I want to see if they can kind of make it on their own and, be like a Doug fir or like a pine that grows here without needing a lot of help from us. And unlike all the other nuts that we've talked about, they're also pretty potentially deer resistant. I haven't tried that out, but I don't see a lot of deers eating conifers around here. And so that's another hope that I have, is that one of their niches could be kind of a place that you can't fence and you don't want to give it a lot of care and water and stuff. And it could be kind of right on the outskirts.
Yeah, either that or interplanting them with smaller, shorter lifespan trees like dwarf apples, so that you get your 15 to 20 years of apples, and then after that the plants can take over. You can get the right soil association just by digging up soil from around existing trees, so that's an easy thing to fetch. And then the other thing that I clued into talking to a customer was that they're completely varmint resistant because the cones are sealed coming up the trees, and squirrels can't steal the seeds out of them. You have to actually put the cones on your wood stove to open them up, so they can't be stolen, which is cool too.
That's the Korean ones.
Well, that's the one that Bruce grows. I don't have as much experience with the Korean ones.
Cool. Okay, I think almonds is the last one we're gonna go through, and then I think it'd be good just to take a couple minutes for everyone to stretch and stuff. And like just so after that, there's not too much to go through, but I think it'd be nice to freshen up. But we'll just do almonds, and I'm gonna hand this over to Peter pretty quickly because I don't have much experience with them. But we have potential to grow certain varieties. I know the flowers are easily frost damaged, and if you look at the picture here, you may, if you didn't already know, almonds are basically like the pit of a fruit that is somewhat like a peach, although the fruit's not very tasty, I don't think, and it's most of the energy is going into making your nice almond inside. But so they're actually, they're essentially a stone fruit, which is just interesting to think about compared to the other nuts. Yeah, Peter, what's your experience with the worthwhileness of growing almonds?
Yeah, I mean, they're a stone fruit that's had the poison bred out of the pit, right? Whereas most of the other stone fruits still have all those potentially toxic compounds in the pit. I mean, I have 5 different cultivars here now, and they produce well when they're pollinated properly, but they flower so early, like around the time of early apricots, that often it's super rainy and cold and windy, and like there's just not a lot of pollen transfer, and I don't find the bees like them either, unfortunately. So they definitely need a protected microclimate for that reason. But if provided they have that, they produce well, and they're amazing, thin-shelled, sweet, nice grocery store-sized almonds. So I mean, they will work. You have to have a couple different kinds for cross-pollination, and they deserve to be planted more. They just haven't been available like locally, and so I've been finding them and bringing them and collecting them and trying to get them out there.
Awesome. I mean, I think when I think of almond, like when I think of the big beekeepers in California, like you hear about them taking the bees to the almond orchard. So there must be something there about pollination being crucial for actually getting a good crop.
Sorry.
Someone else?
Oh, I was just going to chime in that I think Heidi's bees are really attracted to the almond trees we have at the snag. So maybe we're just lucking out by being near a bunch of bees. But our tree was covered in bees last spring.
And did you get a good crop?
I guess it depends what a good crop means, but there were almonds. It's still a relatively small tree though.
Right.
I think it needs a pollinator. The pollinator that it was supposed to have died, and it's just slowly coming back now.
Cool. Okay, well, why doesn't everyone just stretch for 2 minutes, and that way we can all just shake it out, and I'm gonna do that, and I'll be back in 2 minutes.
Hey Dylan, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I've got to duck out because I have a customer coming I forgot about.
Okay. No
Um,
worries. Thanks so much.
Yeah, the other thing I just thought of about almonds was, Gord Baird at EcoSense.
Right. Yeah.
He said he's grafting his almond cultivars onto the wild Myrobulan rootstock, the ones that I'm using for plum, and he says he can get like 6 or 8 feet of growth in a year on that Myrobulan,
Wow.
which is surprising because they're not like actually that closely related.
But they can go onto plum rootstock.
Yeah, and apparently that's a pretty good one. I've never tried to do it, but he says he's having really, really good success with it.
Neat.
Yeah.
But then can you put is that plant cold tolerant or is that like in a greenhouse?
No, that's outside. Yeah, he's field grafting those.
Okay. Oh, cool.
Yeah. So I'm going to try that this year for the first time.
Sweet. So if people want to grow almonds, they should talk to Peter.
Well, I can definitely provide scion wood to anyone who wants to try. I'm finding that, I've found for many years that they're really fussy to graft and a lot of them don't work, unfortunately. But Gord, using the Myrobulan, says they're not fussy at all. And so he's getting a much better take rate per tree as well.
Awesome.
Okay, well, thanks for doing what you're doing. Sorry, I got to
Yeah,
run.
no worries. And I'll make a pitch for Peter at the end here.
Okay, no, I don't need it.
Too bad. All right, folks. I see a lot of empty chairs. Oh yeah, people coming out. Okay, so gonna keep trucking here. Erica had asked a question. If anyone's heard of the Talus Garland effect, using rock piles in dry environments to condense water and retain moistures. I have not heard of it, but it makes sense. Anyone? All right. Okay, next slide. So, what do nuts need? So we talked already a bit about the different soil requirements for the different nuts. And yeah, the well-drained soils will work for chestnuts and almonds and pines. And probably would also work for walnuts and hazels and the others. But the heavier soils and wetter soils can work for walnuts, hazels, and the other like hickories and pecans and stuff. Another soil factor is pH, and chestnuts and pines are both pretty tolerant of acidic soil. I think pines actually need acidic soil. And the others are more wanting closer to a balanced soil, although I think they all tolerate being on the acidic side of things. And my understanding is chestnuts also will tolerate a pretty balanced soil as well. They don't require acidic. Water we talked about mostly as we went. And so yeah, the water, basically like water is probably the main limiting factor in terms of getting good growth on trees around here. You need to be able to they need to be able to drink and to do all their stuff when it's hot, and that's because that's when they grow, right? So I mean, you can get lucky. Like last summer was moist enough that I don't think irrigation was absolutely crucial or made as huge an impact as it can in other years. We actually planted last year we transplanted out about 60 chestnut trees. If you see the weird tubes when you're driving along Lakon next to the big green barn, that's what it is. It's a bunch of chestnut trees in tubes. And part of that planting is actually we're using different drippers on different ones, so different amounts of water. Which so there's some that are getting basically a gallon an hour, 3 hours every 3 days. Some are getting half a gallon an hour, 3 hours every 3 days, and some are getting no water. And I don't think that this last summer was a good year to actually see much results from that. I mean, the ones that got more water do seem like they're a little bit faster growing, but it was a pretty wet year. So I think the other ones all survived and did okay, even so. But I think over time, we're really going to see that the ones that have more water are just going to be exponentially bigger because they can use that water to do their stuff and grow when it's growing season. So, and that's not to say if you can't provide water or you can only, you can dump a 5-gallon bucket once a week through the summer. That's not to say that won't work. Because the other thing about trees, especially the taprooted ones like chestnuts and the walnuts and their friends, is that they're sending down roots that go deep. And so in theory, they should be able to get down to a water table, unless it's, way up in some real sandstony soil. And they should be able to, within a few years, tap into that and use that for their growth. So it's not to deter people from doing it without irrigation, but just to see that as one of the major things you can do to speed the process of growth up, is to provide good regular irrigation. And that's probably it about water. I mean, drainage, I guess, is the other side of water, and we did talk about that a bit. Things nothing loves standing water, really. Although, as we discussed anecdotally, yes, there's hazels that grow in swamps, and hickories and walnuts can handle that. So, but the other ones that like the well-drained soil, you really want to make sure, if it's like the last few weeks where it's been super rainy and, you have some puddles around your chestnut trees, that's probably fine. But if it doesn't rain for a week and there's still a puddle, then that's where you have a real issue. So that is water. Oh, there we go. Okay. So the other next thing that we got to think about is pests, and obviously deer is probably on Denman our biggest plant pest. Or the first one you have to deal with. So, I mean, you can fence areas, and that's what most people do for their gardens and stuff. And what we want to introduce to people on Denman, because we're finding that it's working for us, is tree tubes, which I have pictures of somewhere. I guess I'll get to them. But basically, we're talking plastic tubes that are about 6 feet tall, and that you plop around the tree. And the nice thing about them is that they also act as a kind of greenhouse. So I'm going to talk about those more in a bit when there's pictures and stuff. Voles, squirrels, rodents in general. I mean, voles are going to be damaging the roots. And yeah, we actually haven't lost any nut trees to voles yet. We've lost a few apple trees, so they seem to like the apples more. But basically, you can reduce vole damage majorly by making sure that the area around the trees is clear of the grasses, especially when they're young. So you don't want, like, voles love when there's like fluffy growth and stuff that they can run through and feel sheltered in. So actually, we lost another apple tree this year, another small apple tree to voles, and I kind of finally got to weed whacking yesterday or the day before. Like, things are pretty well cut in the orchard and stuff, but there's some patches where there's some longer grass around trees and stuff. And in my like half hour, 45 minutes of weed whacking, 3 times a vole just jumped out whereas weed whacking ran. And so and we have a cat that eats multiple voles a day, so it's not like they're not disappearing, but there's a lot of, they can be a lot of them out there. And I think I don't think you can guarantee if you're planting an orchard that you don't have any vole damage, but you can definitely reduce it. And the other kind of factor there is when it snows, you want to try and compress the snow around the trees. What we've done, like, this is if it snows and it's going to be sitting there for a week, because that snow does the same thing where the voles feel really comfortable running around underneath it, and they'll often find the trunks and chew on the trunks. Squirrels, obviously, if you're growing nuts, they could become a real issue. We don't have a crazy amount of squirrels on Denman, but I could see that becoming an issue. And I think it's one of those things that you probably, if you're growing nuts, you'd want to monitor and at least have thought about whether you're willing to trap squirrels if they become an issue, for sharing some with the critters. And I think it's when it starts to be like, oh wow, we have 50 squirrels living in our orchard and they're getting everything. So I definitely, the hazelnut orchard we visited in Cowichan Valley, they set squirrel traps, and that was like a pretty regular thing. And I guess raccoons can also kind of fit into that realm, and probably are a lot trickier to deal with. So I would also think they probably won't be as quick working as squirrels to do a whole orchard, but certainly for individual trees, I think raccoons can eat a lot of nuts. And walnut husk fly we talked about before a bit, so I won't talk about it too much, but just, again, it's something to consider if you're considering growing nut trees or walnut trees and trees in that family. Then the walnut husk fly is definitely something you want to be aware of. Oh, someone's saying stellar jays take their hazelnuts. Well, there you go. I think with hazels, they're small enough, you could probably look at netting as an option if you had small enough trees. The other thing is that commercially they shake the walnut trees, the hazelnut trees, to get the hazelnuts off. So, oh, there you go. Yeah. So, sharing with the critters, I think, is a part of like a balanced farming technique or gardening technique, and it's kind of like monitoring and being ready to kind of having some ideas about what you'll do if things become too big an issue. And I think it's just good to think of those things ahead of time, so you're not getting behind on them. Because then if you have if you have 100 squirrels, then you have a bigger problem than if you have 30 and you decide it's time to start dealing with them. So like one thing that me and Nick have been talking about, and that I feel like has kind of become my mission in terms of nut growing, is to figure out a local production system that really works, and like a model that we can share with people, so that we can basically ensure that we're able to grow these trees well, and to do it like, I think speed is important. I mean, not speed at sacrificing quality, but just knowing that we really need to, if we want people to be excited about growing nuts, they need to see a yield at some point, or at least see some serious growth. And so that brings us into the tree tubes. because not only are they a convenient alternative to fencing potentially. I have, oh, can I have a picture? Oh yeah, there we go. Oh. Okay, so this is our field with the tree tubes. We are at 1.5 hours. It's Danny. Thank you, Danny. I'm probably 15 minutes away from the end. But yeah, so if you look here, these are these plastic tubes, and you can see that that's a chestnut tree that's 2 years old. And so what that tube has done is it's sheltered it from the deer. So that, and the deer, there's deer eating grass and the other plants around it and pooping everywhere there. And it's also worked as a greenhouse. There is ventilation holes in the bottom that allow some airflow through. But those trees have had a lot of, they get extra heat from it. And it also worked to kind of self-prune them. So chestnuts would naturally grow in a kind of bushy habit generally. And the problem with that is that it doesn't actually, they're just trying to fill up space and use the light that's available because they notice that there's light all around them. But for them to produce, we want them to actually grow tall. And also we want to get the branches above our heads so that we're not bumping our head. So these kind of serve this triple purpose. And actually there's even a fourth purpose, which is once this tree's grown taller, it's actually kind of a lanky, skinny tree. And if you took that tube off, it might be a bit weak to with the wind and stuff. So it's actually also a support for the tube. And tubes are designed, they're perforated. They're designed to, once the tree gets right out of it. And I'm not a huge fan of plastic and using plastic for things that we don't need to use plastic for, but I do think this is a really good use of plastic, essentially, because if we can be producing nuts 5 years earlier, and if we can convince people to also grow more nuts, it's a real benefit. Let me go back to here. So yeah, that's the tree tube, tree shelter thing, and there is different brands and different designs and stuff, but this is the one that we found, and Nick and I just purchased a bunch, and we probably will be selling some if people are interested. They can talk to us. So the next thing is soil amendments. People might know that I've been involved in. Oh yeah, Wendy says, is there no other deer protection? No other deer protection in that field. The deer can go right up to the tubes. Now there's lots of grass. There's good grass to eat too, and there's wet, wet areas around where there's good grass. But the deer, the plants that we seeded next, the cover crop we seeded right next to those trees totally got munched. So they are working. Yeah, soil amendments, I'm into soil testing and trying to really make optimal soil chemistry for plants and soil biology as well. And so really getting the good stuff going and kind of having a plan, I think you can make a huge difference than just throwing a tree in the ground without knowing what's there, because to me it's like it can be kind of like mentally quite a bit more work to do that, and certainly I had a block when I first started soil testing. Wasn't something I really wanted to have to do. It didn't feel like it was smooth and balanced. It felt like a lot to learn and a lot of technicalities. But now that I'm quite comfortable with it, it's so worth it, because you're really covering some bases and making sure that your other efforts are going to be kind of rewarded as best possible by good growth. So yeah, that's a plug for, you know, either doing soil tests and really trying to get something figured out exactly. We're looking at trying to make amendments that are kind of like tree specific. Because yeah, like when I just planted all those chestnuts last year, I used the soil tests, and I used my regular kind of like calculator that is for vegetables, but I went for a more focused, like, oh, I know that chestnuts like this a bit more and this a bit more, and tried to make sure that that was good, and it seemed to have worked quite well. So and then yeah, so irrigation, I mean, there's not too much to say there other than, I mean, I already covered it. Trees need water, and it's gonna make it so that they grow fast. So figuring out how much water, I think, is partly what we're experimenting with those trees. There is like, you know, is just as much water in the summer good, or is it like as much as you can give them, or is there a limit to what's actually useful? And there's probably a lot to learn there still. And so I would encourage a bare minimum of like having some kind of irrigation plan, even if it's a 5-gallon bucket once a week, or, you know, but also setting up irrigation systems. What I've found is setting up a good irrigation system at the beginning does give you, you know, you can set it up with a timer. So if you're wanting to plant a small orchard, like, it doesn't have to be a 5-gallon bucket for each tree each week. It can be, you know, a few $100s of irrigation parts. You could hire someone like me to install it, set it up with the timer, and then it's, you know, it could be really take care of itself, you know, with some maintenance. But that's, to me, is really worth it, because again, you're putting that effort in and the investment in the beginning, but you're getting a system set up that's going to give you real optimal growth in the long run. And so we got the other piece that Nick and I am working on is trying to really, and I mean, Peter as well has worked on this quite a bit, is like techniques for producing really vigorous trees from the beginning. And we're finding that field grown trees seem to do better than trees grown in pots. And so that's an interesting challenge, in the sense that, like, that would be it's harder to ship bare root trees and whatever, harder to dig up the whole root system properly. But on Denman, there's actually quite a lot of potential there, because if people wanted to purchase, you know, field grown trees from us, we have it all planned out, that they're ready to plant them, they have the sites all set up, well, then we can dig the trees up in the winter and bring them over, and they can go in the ground right away. So there's good opportunity to work on that. And I think for us, it's also, we are trying to work with pots as well and figure out, is there a pot system that can work to produce really vigorous trees? And especially with nuts, is they have a lot of them have the tap roots, and we want to make sure the tap roots don't get damaged. So what's the best way to, is a field grown tree, are you damaging the tap root more by digging it out, or is the pot damaging the tap root, or like restricting the tap root? So that's a kind of a question that we're working on. And I think for me, what that's led me, that kind of taproot question has led me towards with nut trees, is that I actually think transplanting them at a younger age is really worth it, because the older they get, you know, with damage. So you could have a 4-year-old nursery grown chestnut tree, but I actually don't think in the long run that's going to be as good as one that's 1-year-old, because I think you're going to set it back so much when you transplant it. And I've heard lots of stories about that happening with people. So yeah, the last piece of trying to have a good local production system is acquiring and selecting the best genetics for our environment. And that's something that, if people are keen on growing different nut trees, they could definitely be talking with us, Nick and Peter and I and Letitia, about growing, you know, helping to be involved in trying to see kind of which trees do best, and trying to work on propagating those genetics, either through seed or grafting. So yeah, I guess I didn't maybe make it clear, but I see this as a vision for, like, if Denman Island is to become a place where we are growing a lot of nuts and where we're kind of like being a regional leader in that figuring out these systems and kind of like having prescribed models of how people could do it, I think could be really beneficial to selling this idea and helping people get into the like self-sufficiency of nuts, or having our region be able to produce lots of nuts. So there's that picture again. I think there's only a couple slides left here, so you guys are almost off the hook. I'm sorry if it's getting boring. So this is, Nick and I have been kind of working on trying to, yeah, we originally we were trying to get a grant to help us grow a bunch of nut trees, and our thought was it was a climate change grant that we were trying to get, and we thought we would do a free distribution of nut trees, and people try and collect data from people's, like, it would be like a citizen science kind of operation. And I guess what happened is we found out that the funder wasn't really interested in our project, so we never applied. But we still have this kind of vision, and I think we decided to start doing it in a small scale on Denman Island, in some way or another. And part of it is us learning how to grow nuts really well, like I was just talking about, nursery wise, and also allowing us to indulge in our kind of addiction to just planting lots of nut seeds. Has been happening even though we don't have the grant in place. But I think if you look farther, our vision is really about having a nut culture here where people are, looking forward to the harvest of the nuts, and we have many people growing them, and we have a kind of like a place where people associate Denman Island with being a nutty place. And so part of that is having a good nursery. So we're going to be working on building up a nursery that can provide for people. Part of that is we're wanting to do installations. So if people are interested in we'd like to be able to offer the service of installing that. And I think in the long run, like, we'd love to be able to do kind of data gathering and trials. But I think that one at this point, it's just growing the nuts and getting them installed is kind of the first steps. But if we can get funding, we'd like to do more trials and data gathering, and if that includes installing orchards at feasible places. I mean, there's all sorts of opportunities if we can make that. So yeah, funding through agricultural, climate change, and academic avenues, and potentially a Denman Island Festival of Nuts, which would be a great way for everyone to really associate Denman with nuts, but also to kind of help bring this kind of nut culture idea forward. Yeah, Nick and Letitia, do you have anything to add to that slide?
You want to talk about the nut festivals?
Yeah, I think we're hoping once COVID is over to be able to have a big festival of nuts that includes local folks that are already doing stuff with nuts, bringing attention to the nuts that already exist on Denman, and bringing people together for knowledge sharing and workshops. And also, I think sharing about food that you can make with nuts, because nuts aren't necessarily a huge part of the diet of folks on Denman currently. Well, some people definitely are eating nuts, but I doubt everybody's eating chestnuts every day. and maybe one day down the line we would. And so wanting to highlight the types of food, and yeah, just kind of come together in celebration of the awesomeness of growing nuts and a future that we can imagine on Denman with many more nuts.
And I think just to zoom out a bit about the project, like Dylan was saying, like we just are excited about nuts and we want to get nuts out there. And I think they're just a lot more, they're in general lower maintenance and a lot more scalable than fruit. And so we kind of, I was initially really excited about fruit trees when I started getting into perennials. And then it's kind of like, okay, we have 4 apple trees and some plum trees, and how much fruit can you really eat? But the amount of nuts that we could be eating and the way that they can be integrated with livestock and how low maintenance they are, most of them don't need pruning, is really exciting to me. And so we kind of like got excited about promoting nuts, and initially we're trying to go the kind of nonprofit route and just grow nuts and give them out or sell them at cost. And like Dylan said, we couldn't get a grant, but we're still looking for grants and would like to do something like that in the future. And the nursery, I think, comes out of like us asking the question of like, okay, well, how can we do this and make it sustainable so that we're able to grow nuts and get them out there? And that's how we kind of arrived at the nursery idea. And I think another thing about the nursery, like just to go back to the bare root thing that Dylan talked about, I have really seen the difference in growing bare root trees, which basically means you grow them in the ground and then you dig them out and you just have them by their bare roots. And you have to do that obviously when the tree is dormant. And what it means is that they can be planted in the fall or the early spring when the tree is still dormant. And our experience has been that their root systems are just way bigger than the trees that we have grown in pots. So the advantage of pots is obviously you can come and get them, you just pick them up, you put them in your car, it doesn't take a lot of planning. And so I think part of what we need to be doing in terms of like creating a nut culture and creating these optimal nursery practices is changing the expectations of people buying nuts, that if you really want the strongest, hardiest nut trees, potentially the best way to do it is for us to coordinate a little bit and plan ahead and have it so that you're getting a bare root tree that you have to plant at a certain time, often at a time where people aren't really thinking about gardening. Like a lot of people don't think of November as a gardening time, but that's a great time to plant nut trees. So we're kind of thinking November and February or March are really good planting times. And yeah, so that I think just requires, good communication from us, but also a shift in what people think about. Because usually it's like, you get your garden ready, it's May, then you think about what trees you want and you show up, and we'll probably have some trees available in pots, but a lot of what we'll have, we might in May be like, well, we don't really have much right now. And so that's another thing to be thinking about, is we have a few things available to plant this spring. Like we have some chestnuts if people are interested, and like Dylan said, we have tree tubes. And then this year we're planting a bunch more nut trees of basically all the stuff that Dylan mentioned. And yeah, we want to coordinate with people who are excited about nuts.
Great. Yeah, thanks for adding. I feel like I was starting to get zoned out with what I was talking about, so it's good to have some more perspective. I think there's one slide left, and then we're going to do questions, and I'm going to take the screen share off so everyone can see each other and chat about things. The last slide is just, we've been talking about doing a workshop in March. And so if people are interested in that, or in being kind of like kept in the loop about nutty things, it'd be great if you wrote your email in the chat and we'll make a list from all those emails. And Nick and I, as a part of getting this whole nut project going, and Letitia, sorry, I'm getting used to adding Letitia in because it's kind of a newer addition. But yeah, we wanted to offer free initial consults for people who are interested in potentially planting nut trees. And that's partly that we're interested in, we're excited about it. We want to go to people's place and kind of like help guide them that way. And if you're interested and you have the resources to offer to pay us to install stuff, and that's an option we can look at too, and we can talk about. But if you also want to do it yourself, or maybe you want to buy the trees from us, or amendments or tubes, or maybe you want to just go somewhere else and get it. Either way, we want to try and like encourage the momentum on this. So please feel free to contact me or Nick. I will put should I put my email down on the thing? Maybe I'll put my email down on the thing and we can go from now. I'll do that right now in the chat. So I don't forget. So yeah, contact me at dylan.paxton.gayle@gmail.com if you're interested in a site visit or interested in talking to us about nursery stock or tree tubes. And the tree tubes, I should say, I think they're going to be about $15 a piece for the tube and 2 fiberglass stakes that we've been using with them to hold them up. So, if you're going to plant a lot, it might make more sense to fence, but the tubes are pretty easy to install too. You just pound those stakes in and zip the tubes on. And like I was saying before, there's all those benefits. The last point on here is, there's a potential that we might want to be willing to like subsidize the cost of installations of orchards based on some kind of yield sharing arrangement. And this is kind of like, I don't really have a clear model on how this works yet or how this could work, but it's something that I think I like the idea of it, that like in the long run, if our orchard's mature and we're selling a whole bunch of nuts, well, I could also be it could be a benefit if you have, say you plant 20 nut trees, you don't need all those nuts. So part of getting the installation for free or for cheap is that you have an agreement where you're going to share the yield over time. And like I said, this is not a model that I have figured out how it looks, but it's something that I would like ideas on and also just kind of like work towards, because I think it's a way that we can make things happen that might not otherwise happen, right? Like if it's too expensive or seems too like much of a hassle, or like why would I want 20 nut trees? I'm not going to eat that many. Like all these things could be kind of potentially worked out through some kind of arrangement. And I think it goes back to that kind of seeing it as an abundance piece, where we can focus on the abundance rather than the like practical scarcities of the whole thing. So yeah, I think that's the presentation, and we will now go to questions. And what is Brad saying to me? One more thing. Okay. Brad's saying also that we have everyone's emails, so we can also send an email to everyone, and that way people can decide whether they want to continue that way as well. Okay, gonna try and get out of screen sharing. There we go. I can see you. Someone's wanting to ask questions on, a few people asking questions on the chat. Should we start with those, or I don't know how to best do this?
I would suggest that you just take turns with whoever has put a question on the chat, just get them to talk.
Sure. So a question? Can you do it either through talk or?
I have a question.
Yes.
It's about chestnuts. If I have a horse chestnut tree in my yard and I would like to get some of the edible variety, would there be a risk of cross-pollination so that the trees would be producing a nut that is not safe to eat?
I don't think so. No, they're different species.
Okay, great, thank you.
Totally
So
different family even. So they're, yeah, no worries.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
No problem. There's a question in the chat. Any opinions on yellow horn nuts and any recommendations for guilds for guilds for young nut trees? I don't know what yellow horn nuts are. Do you know, Nick?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about them. I ordered some. They sound interesting. I think it sounds like they're a crop being grown a lot in China, and they're kind of a bushy, like even smaller than hazelnuts, I think. And from what I understand, I haven't been able to find anyone in North America who's actually successfully growing them and getting a bunch of nuts from them. I know some people are excited about them. Like I think Gord Baird from EcoSense down in View Royal, he has a whole, like he's talks about them on his website and is growing them and trying to make them go. So yeah, I don't know a lot about them, but I think it's something worth paying attention to. They have beautiful flowers. And yeah, on guilds, I think there's a lot of potential to think about interplanting nut trees with nitrogen fixing trees and shrubs. And yeah, like Peter already talked about the potential of thinking about how a lot of nut trees take longer to yield. And so there's the potential, well, maybe you should talk about what you're doing at your place, Dylan, because I think it's a really thoughtful planning thing in terms of thinking long and short term.
We've gone more for, like, I would say patterning rather than gilding. I guess, yeah, if people aren't familiar with the term gild, it's a permaculture term for when you plant different species together in a way where they're benefiting each other. And usually it's more in a perennial sense. So you might have a nut tree with comfrey underneath and daffodils, and the comfrey provides mulch, which brings up nutrients, and the daffodils, in theory, keep the voles away from the base of the tree, and provide pollination opportunities for the pollinators early on. So you can really build up all these levels of things that support each other. And what we've done here is we've planted things more in rows, and we've interplanted a lot of things in a kind of guild fashion, but it's been more like trying different patterns. Does it work to have herbs, like culinary herbs alongside of hazelnuts? And that's been working pretty good. It hasn't worked as well when we tried to do medicinal herbs alongside the hazelnuts because they didn't mostly make it, or like stuff like that. But in terms of like actual recommendations for guilds for nut trees, I think there's an interesting, I think it's in Washington State, or maybe it's in BC, but it's kind of in the interior, like okay. I believe they're doing walnuts as a kind of like canopy, and then hazelnuts underneath. Cool idea in terms of nuts alone. Oh, my internet connection is unstable. Well, that's too bad.
I think Teresa has a question as well.
No, that was me. That was my, I don't know if you can hear me. That was my question. I was the one who had asked about the guilds.
Okay. Oh, I didn't hear you.
Okay.
But yeah, what we've done is we planted dwarf apples amongst chestnuts, and so that's more of a succession plan where we see the dwarf apples are going to be, over time, they're going to be shaded by the chestnuts, but dwarf apples don't usually live for that long anyways. So it's kind of like it's a transition that we planned out. So like, but yeah, in terms of like actual more detailed guild suggestions, I feel like I don't have specific ones. I guess my feeling is like I've gone for a larger scale, so the guilds haven't been something I've
Okay, Dylan, I think we're losing you. So your connection is getting a little bit wobbly. So I think maybe we could just end this session at this point. Is that okay with you?
That's fine with me, as long as no one else has questions that they want to ask. If I mean, I can also turn my.
They could send emails. They can send emails with questions, and we'll try and get next time a little bit better organized. So there's only one link and one way to get to the talk. And thanks everybody for coming.
Great. And Danny, please don't end the whole thing yet, because I want to just write down stuff from the chat.
Sure.
Hey, I was just thinking, it's Brad. We'll post this to the website, and maybe we'll do a little area underneath it for a discussion forum. So if we all want to discuss online where everybody can see it, we'll provide that opportunity on the GPA site. But we'll send a link to that to everybody.
And a copy of the recording as well? Or how did you?
Yeah, that'll be on the website.
Great. Thanks. I know some people came late. They got mixed up because of the two different websites.
Well, yeah, I guess make sure that's a learning experience.
Yes.
But these things happen.
Great job, Dylan and Danny. Both of you did a great job putting this together, and we'll do more with the following sessions. So we'll see you next week.
Okay. Sounds good.
Great.